Welcome to Networking RX, a podcast devoted to helping business professionals like you enhance your networking skills in order to become more proficient giving and receiving quality business referrals and improving the overall quality of your life and the lives of those around you. The Networking RX podcast is a production of AmSpirit Business Connections, an organization whose mission is to empower business success through networking.
Welcome back for another episode of the Networking RX podcast. I am your host, Frank Agin, founder and president of AmSpirit Business Connections. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for subscribing. Thanks for sharing. Thanks for comments. Today we're going to talk about Dunbar's number, and this is something I feel we need to kind of tackle before we move on to some other research that I have stumbled upon, other things that have been handed to me. This is kind of foundational material. What is Dunbar's number? It's about 150. And I realize that doesn't mean a whole lot to you, but let me kind of give you some background and we'll roll into this and go through what Dunbar's number is and really kind of what applications it has for you. In networking, the quality of people in your life certainly is far more people than the quantity, and I don't think many people will argue with that notion. But believing this, you're probably looking to add more people in your life, and no doubt the thought process is something like this. If the number of people I know is good, then more is better. After all, if you're in the process of building a business or a professional career, prospecting can seem like a never-ending focus. And that's hard to argue with. It's hard to argue with that line of thinking. At the same time, we also have to bear in mind that the people in your life fall into all sorts of different categories. There are friends, there's family members, there's coworkers, colleagues and partners, there are vendors, there are clients, customers, there are neighbors, there are acquaintances, there are even those you know by sight but not necessarily by name. The reality is that your life, you have many contacts. Despite this, not every contact is going to take your call at an odd moment or even recognize your phone number. Not every contact is going to agree to that favor you may ask, and not every contact knows particulars about you, like your age, your hometown, marital status. In short, every contact is not a relationship per se, or not every contact is a relationship, however you want to say that. Even with respect to relationships in your life, however, you're continually looking to add them. After all, who couldn't stand to have another person to whom they could rely on for support? And that notion falls under the heading of more is better. Again, arguably when it comes to relationship, more is better. After all, generally speaking, someone with two parents is better in their life than someone with one. Someone with 10 friends who could rally around them for support is certainly not as well off as somebody who has 20. So there's truth to the notion that more is better. Nevertheless, the logic also seems to dictate at some point less is more. If you have a dozen people sharing their insights and advice, you're more challenged than if you only have a handful of people who can offer advice. So at some point, too many relationships can be a cumbersome burden. Too many cooks spoil the broth. Sort of a logic. But both these notions, more is better and less is more, are accurate, it would seem. More is better. Having more people in your life is better. Having more relationships, more friends is better. But less is more. There's a point where, okay, there's a diminishing returns where I add one more and it's too many. And so the question becomes, where does more is better give way to the notion of less is more? Where's that tipping point? Where's that optimal number of people? And there is a tipping point to it. There's research to support that, and that's what Dunbar's number is. And so I want to kind of get at that. And as I look at my notes, I may break this up into two separate podcasts, not as one giant tease. I try and keep the talking pieces of my podcast below 20 minutes, and I might exceed that if I talk about everything that I've got here on these notes that I've generated. So I may break this up into two. If I end up not doing that, so be it. But I may break this up into two different podcasts. One where I'll just really kind of talk about Dunbar's number and what it's all about, and the second one, really how we kind of apply this to our networking worlds. So, at any rate, certainly lay people are free to debate the appropriate size of a network. And I've devoted a couple episodes to the LinkedIn argument. Is quality more important than quantity? And, when do you have too many LinkedIn connections? And it's kind of the same mind, and there is some interplay between these two. But while lay people can kind of debate this, science has pretty much put this argument to bed. And the answer, give or take, is 150 as appropriate size of your network. And that's Dunbar's number. And where does the answer 150 come from? The answer, a gentleman by the name of Robin Dunbar, who is a British anthropologist and evolutionary psychologist who specializes in primate behavior. Interesting. Now stick with me. Science may not be everybody's thing, and this isn't going to get too geeky science, but this is kind of important to really think about. Anyhow, Dunbar started with what animal scientists have known for years. Primates, which include monkeys, chimpanzees, baboons, and even us humans, have the largest brains of all the mammals. It's not just the brain itself, but rather there's a region of the brain which deals with complex thought and reasoning, known as the neocortex. And us primates, again, monkeys, chimpanzees, baboons, apes, so on and so forth, and humans, we have these neocortex. And science has maintained for years that primates developed a large neocortex, but because we changed from eating things that were an arm's length away, such as grass and leaves, to eating things we had to find, gather, or harvest, such as fruits and nuts. Now, the scientific community didn't maintain that the change in diet itself prompted the development of the neocortex. Rather, the scientific community theorized that it was the action associated with this diet that prompted the development. Traveling away from a home base, remembering what was edible and what was not, and mental mapping where the good stuff was located. While this theory held for a time, it was inconsistent with the fact that there are large-brained primates who primarily eat leaves and fruit-eating primates that have small brains. So there was some inconsistencies there, and it didn't really hold water. However, Dunbar came along and asserted in a 1992 study that primates have a larger neocortex because they operate in groups. Essentially, he started to study the various primate species. And if you go to the zoo, primates hang in groups. You might have a lion with another lion. You might have a lot of animals operating by themselves in the zoo. But generally speaking, when I think of primates at the zoo, there are multiple primates there. And obviously, we know humans operate in groups. So he was kind of looking at the totality of primates and saying, aha, they all operate in groups. The interesting thing is all these groups had different sizes. And what I mean by that is some primate species hung in groups of 4 or 5. Others, it might be 10 or 12, and others it might be up 25 to 30. And when you look into Robin Dunbar's research, he kind of lays it out, and you can kind of see. I can't tell you off the top of my head. Again, this isn't going to get that geeky in science, what was what, but different species had different size groups. And so that was of interest to him, and he realized that there were some differences amongst these different primate species. And what he theorized is that it had to do something with their brain size. And essentially, primates that had a larger brain, specifically a larger neocortex. Again, the neocortex is that portion of the brain that allows me to speak, allows you to listen and understand what I'm talking about, for the most part. But it's that higher thinking that we do as humans, certainly, and primates share that ability. And so what he theorized is that to the extent that the primate had a larger brain, larger neocortex, it had the ability to operate in a bigger group. So what he did is he found a correlation. He found that he looked at brain sizes, and I don't know exactly how he did this. I don't want to speculate how it all happened, but he found that primate species that had larger neocortexes tend to operate in larger clusters of people. And with that correlation, And you start to correlate different points on a graph. Take you back to 7th, 8th grade when we used graph paper. And he graphed all that out, and he kind of knows we kind of know the size of the human neocortex on average. Some are larger, some are smaller. But in doing that, he determined that Homo sapiens, aka humans, would have an estimated group size of about 147.8, rounded up to 150. So that's Dunbar's number, 150. And certainly that's of great interest, and that's how he came up with that. Now, to understand this, think in terms of smaller clusters of people. If there's just you and someone else, you have to account for one relationship in your neocortex, right? So if I'm driving with my wife, I'm really just kind of focused on my wife, and that's it. If there's you and two others, you have to account for three relationships in your neocortex. One between you and each of the other two people, right? So two. And then you have to account for their relationship with each other. So, again, doing the math. My relationship with my wife, my relationship with my son, and my son's relationship with my wife. My brain subconsciously is trying to keep track of all this. Now, none of us obviously deals with two or three people. We have spouses, children, parents, cousins, neighbors, coworkers. There's a plethora of general other categories we have to deal with, and so this all amps up the relationships we need to track. For example, if you belong to a group of 20 people, say a soccer team, and I've thought about this in terms of my kids' soccer, because generally speaking, they have about 20 kids on the team. If you do the math, there are about 190 relationships to track in a group of 20 people. 190 relationships. 19 involving yourself and each other people, and then there's 171 relationships amongst people in the group. It kind of grows exponentially. If you go to 21 people, that adds more relationships to the group, more relationships, and there's a formula to it. It's actually a pretty simple formula. You would take the number of people, subtract it by 1 minus the number of people, and divide by 2. So, for example, if there's 3 people there, you would take 3 times 1 minus the number, or 2. So 3 times 2 equals 6, and you divide that by 2, and it gets you 3. That tells you how many relationships there are if you've got 2 other people you're with. There's a total of 3 people. If you take that number, let's say there are 6 people in a room, including yourself, 6 times 5, which is 6 minus 1. 6 times 5 is 30, divided by 2 would be 15. So there's 6 people in the room. There's actually 15 different relationships your brain, your neocortex, is trying to keep track of. Now, it's important to note this, is that Dunbar's number is merely an approximation. There are people that can probably maintain significantly more relationships than 150, and I won't joke about who. And then they probably have a slightly larger neocortex for whatever reason. And so their brain allows them to function with more people. But no one knows for sure. And this is kind of an inexact science. And then there are those who can't maintain 150 relationships effectively. They may have a smaller neocortex. But it's important to note that whatever your Dunbar number might be, it's not a hard limit. That is, if your particular Dunbar number is in fact 150, your neocortex doesn't strictly prevent you from having that 151st relationship. Your neocortex becomes more challenged and less effective at keeping track of and processing the various relationships. After all, that 150 person doesn't just add one more relationship to the mix. It really adds 151, you with them and them with the other 150 people. So it does become somewhat chaotic. And I notice this when I'm in groups talking to people, not 150 people in a group, but if there's a large group of people in a room, I find my mind's trying to keep track of everything that's going on. And maybe that's just a me thing, but I think to a degree it happens to all of us. In fact, once I had a sales team come in to pitch me on something, and there were three of them. And I had read this research and didn't really think about it, but I had read this research, and I'm like, okay, I'm having this meeting. I wasn't really thinking about it. I thought about it after the meeting, but I was in this meeting, and I was totally taxed, because it's like, okay, I'm trying to focus on my relationship with each one of these people and the things they're saying. And one person's coming at me with a hard sell, the other one's kind of a soft sell, the other one's trying to be logical. So I'm trying to process this. At the same time, they're having conversations amongst each other, right? So there's 4 in the room. 4 times 3, which is 4 minus 1, times 3, which gets you to 12 divided by 2. There's 6 conversations going on in the room, and I'm trying to keep track of all this. So anyhow, when they wanted to come back and visit again, I'm like, listen, only send one person so I can really keep track of this. So anyhow, now you might think that because of computers and social media, we have the ability in the 21st century to operate with more people, and somehow Dunbar's number is obsolete. And again, his study was back in 92, and now we've got LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter. But in 2011, there were researchers at Indiana University who explored this question, and they examined millions upon million Twitter posts amongst 1.7 million Twitter users. Obviously, they can do this because they had computers. Literally doing this 24 hours a day. Aren't computers great? And what they found is that Dunbar's number still holds. We're still really functioning best in that 150 range. So you and I can only effectively maintain 150 relationships. You might have hundreds of Twitter followers or Facebook friends or whatever. Nevertheless, you really have true relationships with no more than 150 of those people. The remaining 3,437 or whatever followers or friends are merely connections. So just kind of a quick primer on Dunbar's number. I'm going to come back next week, and I'm going to talk about applying this science in a kind of a practical way, just to kind of get you thinking about it. That's just kind of some base, and then some other research that people have forwarded me. Adam Connors sent me a great article on how many hours it takes to become a friend, and it really talks a lot about Dunbar's number in there. So I really wanted to kind of focus in and kind of give this foundational material before we moved on. Before I wrap up, I want to remind people that we are looking to add people to our team of franchisees. AmSpirit Business Connections is a unique franchise opportunity in that it allows people to continue operating what they're doing, entrepreneurs, sales reps, professionals, and for much of their week, and then for a few hours in the morning, a couple days a week, they work the AmSpirit Business Connections model, where they help entrepreneurs, sales reps, and professionals become more successful through networking. I said that all in 30 seconds. It's more complicated than that. But if you'd like to learn more about our franchise opportunity and how it could dovetail with what you're doing from an entrepreneurial or professional sense, contact me. My email is in the show notes, or we will provide it here at the end of the podcast.
Thanks for joining us on the Networking RX podcast. Please put what you've learned into action today, and let us know if you have questions, comments, or ideas for future topics. You can email them to us at podcast@amspirit.com. That's AmSpirit.com. Finally, so you never miss an episode, be sure to subscribe to the Networking RX podcast through iTunes, Overcast, or however you receive your podcasts. Now get out and network with someone.
The Networking RX podcast is the copyright production of AmSpirit Business Connections. All rights reserved.